Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I hope you're all well wherever you are and whatever you're up to. I'm Lauren, and in this video, which is part of my top sewing tips series for beginners, I wanted to chat to you about stitches and sewing simple seams, and then also cover some of the basic terminology that you might come across when you're learning how to sew and you're reading sewing instructions or sewing patterns. The sewing machine that I'm going to use in this video to just explain some of the things that I'm talking about is the Brother Innovis F420, and in the interests of full disclosure, the machine has been given to me for free. It's on loan from Brother, and it's through our local sewing machine shop, which is called Frank Nuts Sewing Machine. Brother haven't asked me to do this video with this machine or paid me to do it. I'm making the video purely to explain how to sew to you, but I just wanted to mention where the machine actually comes from, because I know there's been a lot of chat and debate about things like that recently. So the first question I wanted to answer is, what does the right and the wrong side mean of fabric? You will hear that these terms and these phrases get used a lot when you're sewing in instructions and so on. And the right side of the fabric means the side that faces outwards when you use or wear the thing that you're making. So it's where the pattern might look like it's best, or it might be where there's maybe a texture on the fabric and that's showing on the outside. And then the wrong side is just basically the inside, or the side that gets hidden. So on some fabrics, it's really obvious. Like, you can just tell by looking at it immediately, okay, that is the right side of the fabric and that's the wrong side. Some fabrics, it's much more subtle. So it might be that there's a very slight subtle texture on it, and it's not really noticeable until you look really closely at the fabric. Or it might be that there actually isn't a particular right or wrong side at all. The fabric might look identical on either side. So in that situation, it might be useful for you, once you've cut your fabric pieces out or before you come to actually work with them and sew them together, is that you somehow indicate what you've chosen to be the right or wrong side. You just you know, you can put a little chalk mark on it, you could put a pin on it, for example, just so that you know yourself, okay, I've decided that that's the right or wrong side. If it's quite subtle and it's not immediately obvious what's the right and wrong side, again, you might want to mark it just so that you don't get mixed up. And then obviously if it's really obvious, then the clue is just in looking at it. So what you will quite often come across is that an instruction might say, put the fabric right sides together or right sides facing. And that simply means that when you do come to sew two bits of fabric together, that the pattern side, the outward side, the sort of finished side of the fabric that you want to see, that right side, that those two sides actually face and touch each other when you come to sew. And what that means is that once you have sewn them together and you then open the fabric out apart, it just means that cut edge or the raw edge of the fabric is hidden at the back. So the next question that you might find yourself asking is, what stitch on my sewing machine should I use? Now, most of the time, the majority of the time, for just sewing simple seams, sewing two bits of fabric together, you're going to want to use a straight stitch, and the standard stitch length is 2.5 millimeters. So it might be that that's a sort of default setting on your machine. So on this machine, for example, as soon as you turn the machine on, it just turns on a straight stitch and it's already set to 2.5 millimeter stitch length. So the next topic I want to cover is tension, and what tension should you use on your machine. So tension simply refers to the balance of the threads that form the stitches. So when you are sewing on a sewing machine, you've got a thread in the top and you've got a thread in the bottom as well, which is on the bobbin. And as those two threads form the stitches and they lock and loop together, there has to be a balance between them so that the stitches look the same on both sides of the fabric. And that is just to do with balancing the tension that is in the threads. So most of the time, you're just going to be using the same kind of standard tension that the machine is sort of set up. Some machines will automatically set the tension. Other machines, you can alter the tension yourself by moving a little dial. So on this machine, this is where the tension dial is, just here. And majority of the time it's going to be about 3 or 4. So depending on the type of fabric that you've got, the thickness of it, and also the type of thread you've got, if you've got a regular thread or a thicker thread, you might have to alter the tension. But there is a few things that are worthwhile checking if you feel like you do have to alter the tension on the machine. So what do you do if the tension looks wrong? What do you do if you are stitching and when you look at one side of the fabric, the stitches look different to the other? Now, the first thing is just always check that the machine is threaded correctly. When you do thread the top thread of the machine, there's various loops and bits that you have to catch all the thread in, and if the thread's not caught properly in all of those parts, it won't be put under tension correctly and it will then affect the tension of the stitches. So always make sure that the needle is at the highest position when you come to thread your machine. The next thing to check is the bobbin. So the bobbin in this machine is a top loading bobbin, and when you put the bobbin in, you must make sure that the thread is hanging from the left of the bobbin so that it looks like a letter P. And that's how you put the bobbin in and then wind it round. And that is inserting the bobbin. If you put the bobbin in the other way round, then the tension wouldn't form correctly in the stitches and then the tension would look out. So before you go ahead changing the tension dial on your machine, it's worthwhile checking those things first, because I usually find, especially teaching sewing classes, that 9 times out of 10, even more than that, 9.9 times out of 10, when the tension of the stitches look wrong, it's usually due to the bobbin or the top needle threading. The other thing to check is that when you have actually put thread onto your bobbin, that the thread's gone on at tension. The thread must be wound round the bobbin nice and taut. The thread should look smooth. It shouldn't look all sort of loose and kind of bumpy. So check that you've actually wound the bobbin correctly as well. So what I've done here is put 2 different colours of thread in the machine. So on the top I've got a blue and in the bobbin I have got a pink. So what you can see here is that some of the pink thread, which is in the bobbin, has been brought up to the top of the fabric. So as I've stitched it, the tension within the top thread has been so tight that it has drawn the bobbin thread up from the bottom. Now, the other reason that could happen is because the bobbin thread is too loose. So if the thread in the bobbin is very loose and it's coming off too quickly, it's coming off too loosely, then relative to the top thread, it's too loose. And again, that's another reason why it gets drawn to the top. So check out if it's been threaded correctly. And if it is threaded all correctly, then you would just have to lower the tension on the tension dial so that the tension in the top thread isn't as tight and the stitches can be more balanced. Now, the inverse of that, so if you sewed something and you could see the top thread, so in this example that is the blue, if you could see the top thread, the blue thread here, getting pulled underneath to the bottom of the fabric, then it means that the tension in the top thread is too loose and the tension in the bobbin is too tight, and that's why it's drawing it through to the bottom. So that's how you can start to identify where is the tension problem actually coming from, and what you're aiming for, of course, is that the stitches just look even on each side of the fabric. And then in the example of having different colours in the top and bottom, you shouldn't really see the colour from the top thread on the bottom of the fabric. It should just look nice and balanced. So the next thing I want to cover is the seam allowance, and that term refers to the distance between the cut edge or the raw edge of your fabric and where your line of stitching actually sits. And different projects will have a different amount of seam allowance, and it's important that you know what the seam allowance is for the project that you're making and that you quite firmly stick to that when you then sew your pieces of fabric together. So it might be 1/4 of an inch or about 5 mil, and that's usually for patchwork and quilting projects. It might be 1/2 an inch, which is about 1 centimetre, or it might be 5/8 of an inch, which is 1.5 centimetres, 15 millimetres, and that's probably the most common seam allowance that's used in dressmaking. But also 1/2 an inch does get used in dressmaking a lot as well. It just depends where the patterns come from. So when you do come to sew, it is important that you keep that maintained and you keep it accurate as you're sewing your pieces together. So you could use the markings that are on the plate of the machine and you line the edge of your fabric up with that as you sew. The other thing that you might find useful when you're marking out the seam allowance is a little seam gauge like this one here. So it could be that you use chalk to draw out the seam allowance before you actually stitch the machine, or as you're sitting at the sewing machine, you just use that to help you kind of measure it and line things up, make sure your head is in the right direction to keep it nice and even. The other thing that's useful that I find, especially in workshops when I'm teaching beginners, is that they quite like having the magnetic seam gauge on there. So it's just a little metal magnet that sticks onto the plate of your machine, and you can move it around and position it where you want to, and it just gives a bit more of a visual aid as to where to line your fabric up to, really. So the next question I want to answer is, what does backstitch mean? So when you do come to sew 2 or more bits of fabric together, it's important to secure that line of stitching at the start of the stitching and at the end as well. So what's quite commonly used is that you start at the top edge of the fabric, you sew down maybe 3 or 4 stitches, you reverse back again over those stitches, and then you sew down your seam. So it means that that first tiny little section of the line of stitching that you do is actually been sewn over 3 times, and that is enough to really reinforce that stitching and stop the 2 bits of fabric coming together at the top. So more traditionally, what would have happened was the tails of the thread would have just been left longer, and then you would have to tie them off, so you have to tie a knot in the threads. But if you are doing a little reverse, so you're back stitching over that, you don't have to tie the threads off, it will hold it strong enough. So on this machine, the little reverse button is this one here, and you have to just hold it down. So you would start stitching, hold this button down, it stitches backwards as you're holding it down, let it go, and then it will stitch forward again, and then you just do that at the same when you get to the end of the line of stitching. And then you can see when you really put stress on that, you try to pull it apart, it's held the bits of fabric together nice and firmly. So finally, I wanted to talk about finishing off the seam allowance, and that basically means doing something to the raw edges of the fabric, the cut edges of the fabric on the inside of the thing that you've made, to stop them from fraying. Now, some fabrics will fray more than others. If it's quite a tight weave, it's quite a lightweight fabric, it tends not to fray as much. But if it's a much thicker fabric or it's been made from thicker threads, you'll notice that as you touch the cut edge of the fabric, you'll just see the threads coming off quite easily. So it's important to try and control that so that it makes the thing that you've made much more durable and last much longer. Now, it depends on what you're making and what your instructions say, but sometimes those seam allowances are finished together. So that means both layers of the fabric are something's done to them together, so you're going to be stitching them in some way. I'll explain the options in a second. Or it might be that you're finishing them separately. So in that instance, you would use the iron to press them open, press them apart, and then you've got to do something to both sides of that seam allowance there. So one of the most basic easy ways is using the pinking shear scissors, which cut that sort of zigzag edge in the fabric. My personal experience is that works much better on lighter weight fabrics like a cotton lawn, for example. Even when you use the pinking shears, it'll stop the fabric from fraying pretty well. On a thicker fabric, the pinking shears aren't as effective, and you'll find that you do still get some fraying. The next sort of most basic, easiest way to do it is using a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. So on this machine, it looks like this. And when you come to put that zigzag stitch on your fabric, you want to aim to be quite close to that cut, to that raw edge, but still actually on the fabric. The other option is that your machine may have a sort of cover stitch or an overcast stitch where more thread is used to sort of bind that edge of the fabric. Not all machines will have it. This one, on this machine, it looks like this, and then you can see the difference between that and just the plain regular zigzag. Or if you're a bit more advanced, or you're like really looking to seriously go down the dressmaking route, you might want to consider looking at getting an overlocker, which is a completely separate machine, and it uses 3 or 4 threads to sort of create a kind of a looped effect to really sort of bind the edge of that fabric. So that's the machine that's sitting behind me here, and here is a little sample of what that actually looks like when you stitch it onto a fabric. So all of those processes are ways to do something to stop the fabric from fraying. So that's everything that I wanted to cover in this video. Hope you found it useful, just to set some context and give you an idea of the things that you need to know about. If you're looking for something to practice, I would say practice maintaining getting that really even seam allowance, whatever it might be, especially when you come to make clothing. It's really important that you're quite accurate and consistent with that seam allowance. It means that the thing that you make will fit much better, and it will make that process of putting something together much, much easier. So if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and you can subscribe to my channel if you haven't already so you don't miss out on my next video. I've got quite a few planned coming up, but if you've got any suggestions, just drop it in the comments below. I'm always more than happy to take suggestions and feedback on board and answer any questions too, so you can catch me there. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye!